Alright guys, welcome back to F1 News. We may be on the verge of something of an F1 driver revolt against the FIA after leaked comments emerged from the drivers' meeting last night that they believe that the FIA are effectively ruining the show of Formula 1 for the fans as it stands. Who said these words? We'll dive into it in the coming minutes. Very much intrigued to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. First of all, quick updates for you guys. The F1 movie is apparently going to be called Apex. Brad Pitt has been training in a real F2 car at Paul Ricard, driving over 1,000 Ks. So this is kind of like, well, it's Joseph Kosinski movie, right? It's the same story as Tom Cruise in Top Gun Maverick, where, you know, he's kind of in the planes and does all the stunts. So Brad Pitt's going to be in the car, which is pretty cool. And it's probably that Mercedes-looking car we saw yesterday, and it's going to be modified in post-production to look like a real F1 car. So pretty interesting stuff. Those are the updates on that side. Also, Stefano Domenicali says that after the rumours yesterday emerged that they want to do 10 sprint races next season, and I'm like, look, they're going to keep pushing this as far as they can. Stefano says, look, we only want to fill a third of the Canada. We want to create something that can have a sporting value with trophies and, of course, a commercial opportunity. I think that's the right way to go. I see a big tendency nowadays in all sports not to be stable, not to be consistent with the old rules. So basically he says he wants 8 of 24, but that, of course, is what he says that he wants, but when push comes to shove, you know, give it a few years, I think we're going to have more than that. We'll see, hopefully not. Let's talk practice real quick. There was this incident of Nico Hülkenberg smashing into the wall coming off, what, turn 3 or whatever. Now, this is indicative of what is going to be a big problem this weekend and what the drivers are getting into in a few minutes' time, of the difficulty to overtake. This track service is brand new. It was a problem here in Miami last year that if you went off the track line at all, if you went anywhere else on the circuit apart from the racing line, you would just lose all grip. And this is what Hülkenberg ran into. He ran slightly wide, had absolutely no grip, lost the rear end and spun out and crashed into the wall. And this was a key concern last year, and it's going to be, if anything, even worse this year, and is going to make racing very challenging. We saw Max Verstappen say the other day, the cars are so big that you can't really take alternate lines anyway, let alone if you get no grip out there. So this is why the cars are going to, like, this is what a procession is, right? They drive around right behind each other with no alterations. And of course, to counteract the effect of that, you might want to have a nice helping of DRS, and that is not going to be the case this time around. So FP1 was a bit of a weird one. The track was ramping up so hard that it was actually the two Mercedes that are on top this session, but it was back to normality in FP2. Also, Charles Leclerc had a similar issue. He went maybe not slightly offline, but he had a bit of a snap of oversteer, corrected it, and then just went straight on into the wall, deliberately crashed in the way that he did to try and protect the floor and the rear of the car that they've been working on, Ferrari, and have brought a couple of upgrades. But yeah, Verstappen on top by 4/10. Also, the long run pace, it's got to be said. They did some long run simulations. Verstappen was like a second quicker than the Ferraris, and even faster than that than the Mercedes in the long run sims. So look, it's the same story again, and you can say what we're going to discuss with the DRS in a second, that, oh well, you know, it hurts Red Bull shortening the DRS zones. When you've got that much of a pace advantage, and if your DRS is great anyway, it doesn't really hurt Red Bull, right? They're going to be 1-2 anyway, like, unless there's some remarkable circumstances this weekend. So at least you want the rest of the grid and the fight for the podium to be entertaining, but you know, F1 apparently doesn't want that to be the case. So Charles Leclerc says, tricky when you get offline, there's very poor grip, and this is a very key point that all the drivers have mentioned here that is going to affect the quality of racing this weekend. So there's no big damage. Tomorrow's another date, that being today, of course, can go well. And look, the feeling is pretty good over one lap, but in race pace, we're so far behind Red Bull, who are in a league of their own. So again, even with the new upgrades that Ferrari have brought, they brought a new floor this weekend. Most teams didn't really bring much at all this weekend. A couple of small things for various teams, but most teams bringing new things in Imola. Ferrari did bring the new floor, but it's still, maybe it's taken them a step closer in qualifying pace, but they've always been pretty decent so far this season in quali. But in the race, it's going to be another Red Bull cakewalk based on what we saw so far this weekend. Now, a quick comment on the W14 as well, because obviously it was a 1-2 for them in FP1, and there was a lot of confidence, but the lap that Verstappen put in right at the end of FP2, a 1:27.9, that's about 8 tenths quicker than last year's pole time from Charles Leclerc. I believe it was Charles Leclerc last year on pole. So the majority of cars and drivers here already going faster in FP2 than last year's pole position. And okay, the track got resurfaced, the cars are faster, but it just goes to show how quick that car is right in the hands of Max Verstappen right now, and the W14 couldn't really get anywhere close to it. Andrew Chauvelin after FP1, he said that, you know, maybe they were getting flattered a bit in FP1 with the track ramping up, and they went out right at the end about 20 minutes after the Red Bulls did their fast laps. But he says that they made some subtle changes to the car before FP2, but in the cooler conditions, the car car was much more of a handful. Russell went for a spin, Hamilton went off track a couple of times, the car looked like a nightmare to drive actually, and obviously the red flag affecting things. So they're going to try and figure things out for Sunday, but even as he says, our pace in that aspect in the long runs looks okay, but they need to figure something out for quali because overtaking here is going to be very difficult. And look, the teams are saying it, the drivers are saying it, but yet Formula 1 doesn't want to do anything about it, it seems. And Hamilton also gave his thoughts on the car, says we tried some different things. FP1 looked quite good, then it came to FP2 and the true pace came out. It's just a kick in the guts, he says. So he had some optimism after FP1 and it was quickly beaten out of him, but it's okay, they'll regroup, and basically he's just waiting on these upgrades in Imola to turn the tide of their season around, possibly. Reckons they can take some steps overnight. And also I thought this was an interesting comment at the end, but it feels like apart from last year we had the hardcore bouncing. In fairness, Hamilton's car was bouncing a bit here, but you know, one of these street circuits, Baku's an example, Miami's an example, part of the track is based on an actual street, right, in Miami, so the track is always likely to be bumpier than a normal circuit anyway, so it's not necessarily porpoising, and it's certainly not anywhere near as bad this year as it was last year. So as he says, apart from that, which is obviously more fun to drive without the porpoising they had in the W13, it generally feels like we're driving the same car. That's the difficult thing in terms of the inconsistency, in terms of the difficulty to handle it in certain situations. There are a lot of similarities he feels with this year's than last year's, which is, you know, maybe tied to the side pods, some people would say. So he says we're in a much better position, but performance-wise, they're not where they want to be. And even Toto Wolff kind of commented on the Imola upgrades and says, look, we're not going to be running circles around Red Bull when we bring it to Imola. But and also he says if they were free from an upgrade budget cap perspective, they would bring twice as many upgrades. So there's a lot they want to improve on their car, but they simply can't because the budget cap is a thing nowadays, and that is going to affect their chance to improve and possibly restrict any of their hopes of winning an awful lot until next season. So definitely a conversation to be had for the future. But let's dive into the other piece of the discussion on the grip on the track and the possibility to overtake. Baku was one of the worst races I can remember in recent memory, and we could be in for a similar story again this weekend. There is little grip off the racing line. As I say, this was an issue in Miami last year, and with the new resurfacing, it's a massive problem that the drivers drive on the racing line, and therefore that part of the track rubbers in, and then the little marbles that come off the tyres when they're wearing, they go onto the other part of the track, and if you find yourself on the wrong side of the grid, you'll be at a huge disadvantage. If you qualify on the right-hand side of the grid, as you look at it from behind, you're going to have a tough time. There also could well be rain Sunday morning or potentially during the race as well. That would make things interesting if it was to occur, but also the rubber that's now in on the track could potentially be washed away. So it's going to be interesting, but the grip is not really going to be there. So you've got the grip problem. You've then got the fact that this year's cars are not as easy to follow as last year's. I've said a few times, this was frankly an inevitability. The cars under the same set of regulations are going to get better and better year on year. They're going to put more downforce onto the cars, and this year's cars are at least a second faster than last year's, and that's a second of additional downforce generated by the bodywork of the car, and as such more dirty air for the car behind. They also reckon that the floor changes and some other things as well are really hurting the car behind, and the actual real downforce on track is apparently often higher than in the simulations, which also means the dirty air for the car behind trying to follow is also higher than in the simulations. So this is the issue, right? The FIA have come out and said they're shortening the DRS zones again. They've done this most races so far this year, and at the time we weren't opposed to it, right? Because last year, a race like Spa, for example, the DRS was way too good with those last year's cars, and the passes would be done well before you even got to the corner, so it felt a little bit anticlimactic. And overtaking should be a challenge, but it shouldn't be impossible. If you've got 2-3 tenths of a second in hand over the car in front, you probably should be able to get the move done. But, you know, it's not the case as it stands. So last night, the drivers' briefing occurred, and they spoke to the FIA about this, and I do wonder why. Why do they not just delay these changes until after practice just to see? So they had an hour of the drivers' briefing. Much of this discussion with the drivers was on the DRS and why they're shortening the zones, especially after the lack of passing in Baku. The drivers are unhappy. The FIA are reluctant to change back, though, without further number crunching, but it just feels like they're so slow. Surely they must have realised by now this year's cars are harder to follow and therefore to overtake, so keeping the DRS zones as maybe they would have ideally had them for last year based on last year's numbers simply is not relevant. The drivers know best in this situation. Now, this was another comment that was leaked overnight here that Adam Cooper puts out. Along with the DRS discussion, drivers were told about the grid presentation ceremony for Sunday and then reminded that it was for the show. So this is where they're going going to walk out to some walk-on music or something, you know how Formula One's going nowadays with the show being fundamental. But look, as Formula One fans, I don't so much care about the show in terms of them walking out onto the track and, waving to the fans with some walk-on music. I care about the show on the track itself. Is the racing actually entertaining? That's kind of what a lot of Formula One fans are here for, I would well imagine. So one of the drivers said, and then pointed out, that without overtaking, there wouldn't be much of a show for the fans. So this is quite the statement, right, to come out with. And, you can only wonder who actually said this out of the drivers. We know that many of the drivers have been kind of vehemently against these changes. And Max Verstappen is obviously not happy with some of the decisions being made lately with regard to sprint races and trying to do everything for the show. But the reality is that the overtaking is getting harder and they're trying to make it even harder. And look, if you're Max though, with no overtaking, does it matter for Max? Like, the Red Bull's so good, he's going to be at the front anyway. So maybe there's an argument this could be another driver. I know that Alonso, this was another question, would it be Fernando? But, he hasn't really been too opposed to these DRS reductions, probably because the Aston Martin is actually not so good in the DRS zones. So maybe there's an argument that they'd prefer to have less DRS and do moves such as Alonso's move on Carlos Sainz in Baku. So yeah, who do you guys think said this quote? Could it be a Hamilton? Could it be one of the Mercedes guys? Could it be Alonso? Would it be Max Verstappen? Possibly. It's kind of difficult to say, but I think that point is probably echoed quite widely across many of the drivers that, there's all this talk from Formula One and the FIA about the show and bigging it up for the fans, but yet they're like, look, you guys are actually running deliberately counter to what we're trying to achieve here by, for many reasons, overtaking is going to be challenging enough anyway this weekend, and then the DRS zones are shorter regardless. So we'll see how it goes in the race tomorrow, but if it's another procession, I'm not going to be happy. The drivers are going to be happy, and they've already made their thoughts known on the matter. So very much intrigued to your thoughts on all this stuff in the comment section below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I will see you next time.